Hey guys, we have Joe Escobedo here with us. So how I discovered Joe was I was on LinkedIn, and I really am a geek when it comes to marketing, and I really love Joe's stuff. I look at his slides, I look at his videos, I look at his content, and I learn so much. There's a lot of fluff out there, and Joe is definitely not one of those people with fluff. So Joe, what he says is he helps Fortune 500 brands gain practical insights on social content and branding. So Joe is also an author. So his book, Asian Growth Stories, a practical guide to marketing and growing your business here in Asia. So besides that, Joe is also a trainer and has trained over 7,000 professionals throughout his career. And little known fact, so Joe is also known as Joe Li in China, right? So Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bob, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, yeah. My Chinese is a bit rusty or not. I will ask you questions in Chinese as well.
All right. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
can stick to English for now.
But Jolie
Perfect.
is your Chinese name, right?
Jolie. Yeah, Jolie is
Yeah,
my Chinese name.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
so as I said in the introduction, you are the author of Asian Growth Stories. It's good to talk to someone finally in the same time zone. You're in Singapore, I'm here in Malaysia, and we're both around 2 p.m. right now. So there's a lot of growth going around the region. We have unicorns, we have Grab, we have Lazada, like you said, we have uh, Gojek, whatever you name it. There's a lot of growth in this region. So my first question to you, which relates to your book, is what can we learn from growth stories here in Asia?
Yeah, I think there's a lot you can see, and maybe I'll share kind of a little bit about my background. So I've been in
Yeah.
Asia for over 12 years, and so one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is because I found it very difficult to come up with to find case studies and examples of local Asian companies that are doing some tremendous stuff here in terms of growth, in terms of marketing and sales. So I was like, I asked my friends, I asked my family, like no one could really recommend a book. So I was like, okay, I'll just write one myself. And I was fortunate that I've, interviewed countless executives, entrepreneurs, founders to really find out what are some of the things that they did right to grow
Mm-hmm.
their company. And then based on that, I developed what I call the trust framework.
Mm.
So these are some of the elements that I've seen across different organizations that they've used to build their brands. So the first one for T is trust. So how do you go about building trust with your consumers? I think this is a big thing, particularly in our region where there's a lot of counterfeit goods and things like that. So how do you go about building trust? Second is relationships. How do you go about
Mm-hmm.
building relationships with your audience? Not just thinking about it from a transactional point of view, but how do you look at it from the longer point of view? And then U is for up close. So how do you get up close and personal with your audiences? Not talking about stalking anyone, but
Yeah.
how do you really, find out more about them so you can create more relevant content, better experiences for them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and another one that I thought was quite interesting was shake up. So how do you shake things up? And you see a lot of brands that are doing that here. And I spoke with a very successful CEO and I said, okay, how are you shaking things up in your space?
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me this beautiful analogy and he said, look, I am looking at the gaps. So for example, imagine your industry is a wall. He said, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the gaps
Mm-hmm.
within this particular industry and I'm trying to fill those gaps.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about these massive kind of, innovations you have to create. You have to create the next iPhone, but just identifying these small gaps
Mm-hmm.
can lead to really a shakeup in your space.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one, which I think is on everyone's mind, is talent. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you go about building the right team? How do you build the right resources to
Mm-hmm.
really get the business off the ground?
Yeah.
And so a couple of examples that I cite in the book are TWGT,
Mm-hmm.
which is a Singapore-based tea company, which is now a global company, and how their CEO Taha really spent a lot of time thinking about the brand, from the
Mm-hmm.
aesthetics, from the way people interacted with the customer service,
Mm-hmm.
all of these elements that he really thought about very deeply, and how he was able to use that to grow the brand globally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of interesting case studies of local brands are starting to go global. So I wanted to capture some of those stories.
Yep. TWG, I've definitely been to it in Singapore, and it's also here in KL. For some of the listeners here in the West, it's an experience to have tea in the middle of the shopping mall. I think I was there in Marina when I had it.
Mm.
So I think another interesting story that you had in your book, and I've seen in your keynotes, is there is a story about Four Fingers, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Four Fingers is another interesting one. So I spoke with Steen, who was the former CEO of the company, and how
Yeah,
he
so
was
so
able.
let's explain to the audience what Four Fingers is. They don't know what it is.
Yeah. So
Right?
Four Fingers is kind of a local fast food chain. It focuses on like they call it Korean fried chicken.
Yeah.
So the concept itself is quite unique, but I think the experiences that they deliver are very unique as well.
Mhm.
Because what he did is he looked at the existing, fast food establishments, and he said, okay, how do we do things differently? So from the style, like a lot of traditional fast food chains, they look the same. They're very plain, very vanilla, and they said, okay, we're going to do something very different. So if you look at even their interior on the walls, it's like graffiti, it's all these things to really give a different vibe in terms of the music they play. It's more like hip, it's like K-pop, it's very different from anything you would hear in like a McDonald's or a Burger King. And even the offering is quite different as well, like combining Korean fried chicken, and there's a lot of things. Like I said, he looked at the wall in terms of his industry, and he said, okay,
Mhm.
how can we really do things differently? So they're really one of my favorite examples of building a brand based on shaking things up.
I think you also shared that they have a Spotify playlist for different outlets or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So that it's all about providing like local experiences. So they'll have the local employees pick the Spotify playlist
Mm-hmm.
for that specific outlet. So once again, it provides a unique kind of personality to each outlet, which you don't really get in a lot of the big international chains anymore because it's all very standardized. But they wanted to provide a very kind of local kind of style to each
Mm.
outlet, which I thought was great.
Yep. Localization is very important when it comes to a brand. And I can testify to Four Fingers. All of my friends. So just context, I'm in Malaysia. Joe is in Singapore. It's like Canada and America in a way. In a way. So every
Yeah.
time my friends fly to Singapore and they bring something back, it's Four Fingers chicken. They would
Mm.
on purpose go and take away, buy it back to Malaysia for me. So you know how good is the brand when someone takes it out of the country.
Yeah, exactly. I think
Yeah.
they've created such a strong kind of product as well as marketing behind it. Then, yeah, anytime you're here, you got to try it.
Cool. So yeah, I've been doing marketing interviews. So just a bit about this show. I like to talk to business leaders. I like to talk to marketing leaders. And you're one of the first few, one of the few that I talked to in Asia. So there's a lot of business leaders in the West that we know, because they're on Forbes, they're on whatever. But there seems to be a lack of knowledge of, marketing and business leaders here in Asia. I don't know many in Singapore. I don't know, and many don't know people here in Malaysia as well. So,
Mm,
I think we can talk about, people. The only guy that people know is Jack Ma, unfortunately. But
yeah.
what are some of the business leaders to follow here in Asia?
Yes, that's a very good question, and that's one thing that I'm always very particular about. Whenever I see these top 20, content marketers or the top
Oh,
10, it's always very American centric or UK centric, and I'm like, guys, there is so many amazing talent in the world. If you look at Israel, if you look at all the stuff in Asia, there's so many talents that don't really get their due respect. So that's one of the things that I really want to do is highlight some of the local Asian leaders out here because there's a lot of insight, there's a lot of experiences, um, and some just tremendous talent. So some of my favorite examples are marketing or business leaders that have really created their own community. So not just, putting out content just for the sake of it, but putting out valuable content that's very relevant to a specific community. So I'll cite a couple of examples, one of which is Felix Lee. So Felix Lee, I believe, is based in Singapore, and he has a very strong design UI UX community. He creates these kind of beautiful, these decks on LinkedIn, and they get tons of engagement, tons of traction, because he's very much speaking to that community. So I've actually pulled some of the best practices from him in terms of like the visual aesthetics, the way he puts together his decks, very simplified, clean, stylish. So, and he's constantly sharing kind of best practices with the audience. So he's really good in terms of design. In terms of like SaaS marketing, so like local, like for marketing for small medium-sized enterprises, Dave Fillarmi from HubSpot is really, really good. Once again, Dave's one of those people that he's very much about building community. So he has his own Slack community. I think it's called APAC Marketers, if I'm not mistaken. He's very active on LinkedIn. He engages the community with HubSpot. So he's doing all these different things to nurture this little community of SaaS marketers and SMB marketers. And then if we look at one outside of Singapore, Virginia Batista. So I've done multiple interviews with her with Forbes, tremendous woman out of the Philippines. And she is what I would consider like a content marketing guru. But the great thing about Virginia is she focuses on a particular audience. So she's catering to the freelance market, which is massive in the Philippines. So she's constantly sharing insights in terms of, how to better promote yourself, how to build your brand, how to, charge more, how to escape kind of the race to the bottom is what she calls it. So all of these relevant tips there are very, very keen and interested to her audience.
Yep, those are some great people, and definitely after this call, I will connect with them and say a reference that Joe referred me to them on LinkedIn.
Please do.
And also, I think since you talk about SaaS, I think not many people know, since we are on this call, that one of the top SEO SaaS is from Singapore. A lot of people don't know Ahrefs is from Singapore, and most of the Ahrefs team is in Singapore as well. So that's interesting to check out too.
Yeah, like I said, I think there's a big growing SaaS community out here. And I think it's one of those things that they don't really get the attention or limelight that they probably deserve.
Yeah. They don't. Yeah, I know a lot of startups here and a lot of big brands that come out of Malaysia. That should be highlighted, but it's often overlooked. So we have to work on that, Joe. We have to work on that and get more of them out. Yeah, I have to get more of them on this show. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Joe, I love your content on LinkedIn, and you talk about this a lot in your keynotes. So content for me is the oxygen when it comes to marketing. So you have a lot of thoughts on content, but just to start it out, how to create content that stands out?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple of different things that I always look at. The first of which is really adding personality to your content. A lot of the times it's very generic. It's very vanilla, plain style, which you see so many of that. You see so many like top 10 ways to do this, top 10 ways to do that, that eventually like your mind just kind of shuts out and it becomes like a blur. So one thing that I try to do from a personal brand is to check my own kind of style, humor, and approach. So for me, I've kind of honed in what I call like bite-sized practical insights. So there's some, experts out there who focus on research and trends. There's some who focus on, looking at predictions. I focus on these kind of small bite-sized actionable tips that people can take away and use the same day. So I think having kind of a focus is one of the good things. And then also in terms of storytelling, I think this is one of the things that I picked up from when I was writing at Forbes, is that I saw kind of the same headlines over and over and over. And I said, okay, how do I make my stories unique? So I always tried to find one hero in my story. And the reason I did that is because people relate far more to people than they do kind of any brands, products, or services. So I would find a hero and I would share not only the highs, but also the lows. So share their entire journey in the story itself. And to this day, people still write to me and they're like, I remember that person you wrote about because I could relate. So one example was a CEO who got fired from his company. And he later rejoined the company and built it back into a multi-million-dollar company. And so that for me is a great kind of underdog story, and something we can all relate to. Whether you've been laid off, or you've been kind of in that situation before. It's like, how do you climb back up? So I think that example was really compelling for a lot of the audiences listening. Um, Another thing that I found out quite effectively when I was writing for Forbes is to include numbers in your headlines. And I try to do this to some extent now, but not in the way that you would generally think about it. So for example, a lot of times we use numbers as like 10 ways to do this or 10 ways to do that. But I realized if you add like certain numbers that have impact. So for example, this company was able to grow from 4 million to 40 million in 3 months. Here's how they did it. So something that's a bit more tangible that you can kind of wrap your head around. The numbers visually help stand out. And also it's more compelling to read than just hey, here's how this company grew through, content marketing. It's not as compelling as adding a bit of numbers behind it. Another thing that I really, really focus on is formats. So once I have the piece of content, I'm constantly producing different formats. So if you notice, even on LinkedIn, sometimes I will start with maybe a blog article and I'll reformat that into, a short video or a document or an infographic or some other format, because I realize that people like different formats. And a lot of the times they like more visual stuff. So I polled my audience last year and I said, okay, what type of content do you want to produce? Do you want blogs? Do you want videos? Do you want, what do you want? And it was quite unanimous in terms of videos. And I was like, you really want to see this face on video? I was like, okay. But I think it was quite interesting because it's there's this push towards more visual elements and content. I think it's where you see the explosion of Instagram and some of the other more visual, compelling formats. So how do you go about applying that to even B2B marketing, which a lot of times they think you got to create a very stuffy white paper. It's got to be over 3,000 words, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, does it really? So how can we learn and make things more visually, more bite-sized that's, the audience can easily consume?
Cool. And I think on LinkedIn, I've seen some of your slides, and I love slides because it's a faster way to consume information. I like video, don't get me wrong. I love doing video because it's easy to do. It's the easiest format to create for me. Slides is a very visual and very fast way to consume content. Like you would have 10 slides and I could consume them within a minute. So so experiment with different formats, and I have teams with different clients that run around converting them into different formats. So that's a good thing to learn. And so when it comes to creating content, a lot of people just do it. I've seen a lot of people just putting it out for the sake of frequency, for the sake of just putting out content and not achieving what they want when it comes to content. So I think you talk about it in some of your content or keynotes, is some of the pitfalls when it comes to content marketing.
Yeah, so I think this is a big one for me. I think I absolutely agree. I see too many organizations creating content just for the sake of creating content, or they see their competitor doing it and they're like, oh, we have to do it too. I'm like, why? What is the purpose behind it? Like, I'm a very big advocate of content marketing, but I think unless you have an objective behind it, it doesn't make sense. You're wasting your time and money. So I actually did a keynote on this recently in terms of the 3 deadly sins of content marketing that I've seen working with multiple Fortune 500 companies. What are some of the common things that are cropping up? So one of which I talk about a lot is creating content for you, not necessarily for them, meaning your audience. So I've trained companies and I asked them, okay, how do you come up with your content ideas? And they'll say, yeah, you know what? We'll usually get together, the marketing team, and we'll brainstorm ideas. I'm like, okay, how do you know if it's relevant to your audience? And they're like, well, that's just the way we've been doing it. And I said, okay, there are different ways in which you can make it more applicable to your audience. So speak to them. So for example, I'm constantly polling and surveying my audience to see what kind of topics, what kind of formats they'd be interested in. If you don't have the luxury of that, I always recommend speaking with two departments in your organization. First is sales team, because the sales team will generally give you some very good insights in terms of why people are buying from you, why they're not buying from you. And then you can relay that back into your content strategy. And the other is your customer service team. Same thing. They hear all the why we love your brand, why we hate your brand, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to bring them into the conversation when you're creating your content strategy. Otherwise, it's this very inside out approach that I've seen over and over. There's a huge disconnect in terms of what a marketing team thinks is good and relevant versus what the audience actually wants. So I think that's something I always, advocate for clients. The second is really what I call neglecting who matters most. So I showed this in the form of the funnel. And I said, most people talk about, the traditional funnel like this. But I said, you honestly need to flip it upside down, and you need to focus on first creating content together with your customers and partners. I don't think enough organizations do that effectively or even think about doing it. So they're very keen to push out these very broad, generic prediction pieces, et cetera. But I was like, going back to the storytelling, like, who's your hero? Your hero should always be your customers, your partners, your employees, all the people that really, drive the business. Without that, you have nothing. So how do you get them involved in the process? How do you tell their stories along the way? Because those are the stories that really stick with you. It's not just, we have this new product that came out, or we have this prediction for 2020. It's great, but what are the people behind that? So how do you get them involved in strategy and in the creation itself? And then the last one, which I think is quite common, is forgetting the marketing and content marketing. So for that one, I've seen a lot of organizations start, as you said, creating content, and 6 months, a year down the road, the CEO or the management team says, okay, how is this performing? And, they look puzzled. They're like, So when you're doing content marketing, I always recommend putting some KPIs to it first, even if it's, predictions, if you haven't done it historically. But setting some KPIs early on, you can see, okay, one, did we hit our KPIs? And two, the KPIs will dictate the type of content you create. So for example, if you look at your funnel and you say, okay, our issue is brand awareness. So the bulk of our content has to be towards that. Then that your content has to be less product centric and more kind of tips and best practices focused. So little things like that will dictate the type of content you create. Otherwise, you're just creating all kinds of content with just what I call the pray and spray. You're just hoping, you push everything out there and you hope it's going to work out, but it rarely does. So those are the three kind of deadly sins that I talk about.
Yeah, it's very bad to commit all those sins. One way that I have found to get ideas for content is sometimes I run Facebook lead gen ads and ask Facebook for questions like, do you have questions when it comes to content marketing? And when I do a webinar, so this is something I do for my client, I cut out the certain part of that question, and it's like you don't even need to think about the content. Sometimes it comes from the questions, like you said, make it customer centric. So that's another way to do it as well. And
yeah, no, I love the idea of running Facebook ads to find out kind of the common topics or challenges. Yeah, very good idea.
That's how I created content for one of my educational clients. So that's that. So moving on to one of my favorite topics, and this is the thing for 2019, 2020. And a lot of people like to talk about it. So you're also a trainer when it comes to social selling. So, not many people know what is social selling yet. It's sort of a new topic. So let's go to, what is social selling, and, what are some of your strategies when it comes to social selling?
So that's a very good question. Yeah. So social selling for me it's about providing value and offering helpful content until the prospect is ready to buy. Now, the biggest mistake I see with social selling is they kind of abuse social media channels. And I see this a lot of salespeople when I first, start working with them. They will be blasting out these messages, these in-mails, and they're these very
Oh,
generic responses. And I'm like, imagine if someone sent that to you. And I've spoken with many, senior executives, and they hate that stuff. They either block you, or they unfollow you, or there's some kind of,
I remove you as a connection.
yeah, exactly. I do the same thing.
I don't want my connections to get the same treatment, so I will remove you as a connection. That's it.
Absolutely. I do the exact same thing. And I always give this analogy when I see that is like, think about social selling or building relationships with prospects as dating. So I think too many salespeople, they want to get down on one knee and they want to ask the other person they want to marry them on the first date. And I'm like, how many of you would actually say yes to that? And then they always go, and I'm like, yeah, because that's the same way that you approach your prospects on, social media. You're sending these, hey, I don't know anything about you, but do you want to catch up, or do you want to jump on a call? Like, it very, very rarely works. And I've seen the conversion rates are significantly lower. So what I've tried to do is flip the script and say, okay, how do we focus on the social? Because honestly, if you can focus on the social element, the content portion, you don't actually have to sell, which is what I've seen over and over with some of the most successful social sellers. And to really help a lot of the participants in my trainings, I've developed a 3C framework when it comes to social selling. So the first C is credibility. So credibility is extremely important. We do judge a book by its cover. If you have a poor profile, if your photo looks creepy, as one of my participants said about another participant, then you've already lost the battle. So how do you go about building credibility? How do you go about, making sure your profile photo, reflects you in the best light? How do you put together a compelling headline that has the right keywords, that has the right value proposition, so you're attracting the right audiences? So that's the first thing you need to do. The second is conversation. So conversation really takes place in the type of content you create. So content, as we talked about, is one that's really addressing your audience's challenges, their goals. And one of the best ways to start a conversation, and I said, whatever industry you're in, one of the most powerful pieces of content you can create is FAQs. So for example, you already talked about, finding the common challenges they have, and just answer that. Like, it doesn't have to be a full-on research paper. Just simply answering their questions, you start a dialogue. And then from there, you can see, okay, who is engaging with it? So if it is a potential client, then we move on to the third C, which is conversion. And conversion is not necessarily like selling on social media, because if you do that, you've already lost the battle. What I mean by conversion is, okay, how do you take the conversation, maybe directly? How do you direct message them? And, maybe thank them for engaging with your content, provide any additional resources that might be relevant to them. It's once again about continuing that conversation and moving along the path. And then from there, the final objective is really to get that, that offline meeting or that call, because that's where the actual sale takes place. Social selling is just really setting you up to get that meeting. And also, once you're in that meeting, you're at a different level in terms of your perception. They've already trusted you. They've already seen the credibility. So the conversation becomes very different. I've seen this many times in the past. Agencies and salespeople go in and say, okay, here's my sales pitch, et cetera, et cetera. And there's too many salespeople that do that. Whereas if you do social selling effectively, at least in my experience, the conversation is very different. So the conversation is, okay, what are you working on? How can I help? That's it. It's not selling your products or services. So it's about continuing that process and across the entire journey to really drive sustainable sales. I think not just trying to fight every day and sending out messages, because it's not very sustainable. So this is a sustainable way to do it.
Yep, I see this as something very important. So I had a conversation with all the education institutions in Malaysia recently, and not to talk about anyone in specific, but no one is doing this. because it's sort of leading with content. The best way to establish credibility and to build a good conversation is to solve your customers' problems, whether through content or through conversation. So like you talk about agencies, and not many agencies, not to, you know, talk bad about agencies, but not many agencies are creating content about their expertise, not at all. They are just being very salesy about it. So if
Yep.
everyone did this, it's a very good content play. First, you solve the problems, and secondly, when you get on a call, it's not so much you selling to the customer. It's sometimes even better, in my experience, that the customer is selling themselves to you to work with you. So it can be in that way as well. I think you've had experiences like this, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you're right. At that point, you get to pick your clients rather than your clients picking you.
Yeah, that takes a lot of work, but that's the way to do it. That's build credibility, and that's the way to do it.
Absolutely.
So Joe, so this is more to the last part of our call here, and more to something that all of us can learn. And a lot of my audience are marketers. Myself, I'm a marketer, and a lot of people on LinkedIn are aspiring to be thought leaders. And you've spoken at many stages in Singapore and across Asia. You've done trainings. You've worked with top corporations. So how did you yourself personally establish that thought leadership?
That's a very good question. And to your point, I still don't consider myself a thought leader. I consider myself some dude who just likes, sharing, relevant content.
Okay.
But I can briefly share my experience, because I think and I haven't shared this, in public, is that my journey has been quite long. So I think a lot of people see the success I've had over the past couple of years, and it's like, oh, it's overnight success. Like Joe woke up and then all of a sudden he started doing all these talks, all these trainings, etc. Wasn't always the case. I actually started out blogging many, many years ago because I'm very passionate about writing. So I wrote I had a travel blog and then a kind of business blog many years ago. No one wrote it. No one read it. But I just kept, writing and writing and writing and writing. One, because I think I enjoyed it so much. And two, I wanted to find ways to add value to my audience. And then lo and behold, by doing that, I got connected to a writer at HuffPost who introduced me to the editor at Forbes. And then I ended up writing for both of those publications. And then once that started, I wrote for Inc. and a couple others. And it just kind of snowballed.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most frustrating or challenging things I always got is people would always ask me, oh, how do I write for Forbes? Or how do I write for this kind of publication?
You call it the Forbes syndrome.
The Forbes syndrome. Yeah, I call it the Forbes syndrome. Yes.
Yeah.
I call this Forbes syndrome. Everyone's to write for Forbes. Yeah. And I always ask him, like, okay, have you written before? And they're like, no. And I was like, why would, it's one of those things that, you got to start from somewhere. Like everyone just wants to jump in. They want to be, that famous person on, the cover or writing. It's like, there's a journey. There's, everyone has to pay their dues. And even when I started my public speaking, when I first public talk I ever did, I was invited by a women's organization here in Singapore to present at one of their meetings. And it was, I think, 5 people in the audience. But I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I enjoyed it so much. And once again, another question they say is, okay, how do you get, these paid speaking gigs? How do you get on these big stages? Because I've presented along with, CEOs, royalty. And I'm like, look, I started, very humbly. I started, very small talks, free talks. I did, I think, maybe 15, 20 free talks before I even got my first paid one. So it's one of those things that it takes time. And in doing the free stuff and writing when no one is reading it, you get to refine your skill set. Like I would have been terrible if I jumped right in and started presenting to 3,000 people. Like it wouldn't make any sense. I'm not a natural speaker. So I think first advice I always give people is do something you're really passionate about. So for me, it's writing. I would write even if no one read it. So do that, and then just be willing to put in the time and effort,
Mm,
because it does take time. But I think the keyword here is consistency.
mm.
Consistency is really the the secret ingredient when in terms of building your thought leadership. Um, and people will recognize it over time. They'll see you as a person to continually go to for new insights and new best practices. So I think that's always the advice that I give to people when they're trying to build their own kind of thought leadership or personal brand.
Yeah, start small, put in the hard work, keep writing, keep creating content,
Yeah,
and say yes to everything in the beginning. So that's a way to go too.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we are coming to the end, and I think the last question would be sort of personal as well. So as marketers, I struggle with this as well. Uh, I don't. It's not to brag, but I am proficient with things like Facebook ads, SEO. I am also very good at analytics, and also I think you can see I'm very good at content. But I struggle to find, like you yourself, you have found your specialties to speak on content, social selling, LinkedIn. So how did you find your personal USP? How did you say, hey, these are the things that I should talk to people about?
So that's a very good question, because I came traditionally from a PR and comms background. I did that for about 10 years before I even moved into digital marketing.
Yeah.
So when I started my company about a year and a half ago, I was like, okay, I'm going to do comms and maybe a bit of content marketing, because at that point I've been doing it for a couple of years. But what I realized is that if I only was very stubborn and only focused on that, um, I would have struggled. The business would have struggled. What I realized is that there was a massive opportunity to take the same skill sets in terms of communications, in terms of content creation, and
Mm-hmm.
provide that to salespeople.
Mm,
So I think the market really pushed me to focus on social selling. It was never something I had planned when I started the business. I barely knew what social selling was when I started it, but I got enough demand from organizations saying, hey, look, can you teach my sales team to do basically the same thing you're doing to drive leads and prospects? Um, so that was quite an interesting kind of turn for me, is listening to them, and it's been tremendous in terms of the business. I think I've trained, I don't know, several thousand salespeople at this point, and I don't come from a sales background, which is even funnier. But I think the results that the participants have had has been tremendous.
mhm,
Um, Another thing that I really struggled with is really finding what is my value proposition. What is
mm,
the one thing that makes me unique? And even when I share this exercise with participants and I ask them to come up with their own LinkedIn headline or whatever social media headline that they're working on,
mm,
it's really tough. I think I struggled really a lot. So I said, okay, how do I, going to the same thing, how do I put it from the customer's
mhm.
point of view? So that's when I thought of this hack. I'll have to name it something fancy, but it's essentially leveraging your existing testimonials.
Ah.
So at this point, you have happy customers who have written a testimonial about you
Mhm,
via email or LinkedIn. What I do is I take all of those testimonials, I copy and paste them into a word cloud. So if you just Google the word word cloud,
mhm,
copy and paste that text, and then hit enter, and you will see the bigger the keyword, the more commonly it's used.
mhm,
So I said, okay, what are the common keywords that people are saying about me? Because it's very difficult to tell it from your perspective. Like, I'm great because of this. Like, it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
mm,
So what I've actually done is reversed engineer it. And I said, okay, what are some of the keywords? What are some of the things that clients are saying about me on a regular basis?
mhm,
Um, and then reapply that to my own kind of USP. So that's how I came up with the practical insights portion of my headline. Not something I had ever thought about when I was putting together my value proposition, but I constantly kept hearing it after every training, after every consulting, like, this is so practical, it's so, actionable. And I was like, okay, well, maybe that's what my focus is. Maybe that's what people know me for. So I think the big mistake brands make is they think the a brand is what you say about yourself, but when in reality, it's what people say about you.
Mm.
So I think that is kind of a aha moment that I had recently, to really put all my messaging from the customer's point of view rather than my own.
Mm. That's just gold. So it's more of first, what I learned is there might be a demand or in the market that you're not aware about. So like you said, you were coaching salespeople. And then secondly, the USP should come from your customers, because that's what they find the most value in, not the thing that you think that you're giving the most value. I think I have some reflections on that as well. So a lot of clients come to me, back to me, and talk about content. So that's interesting to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thanks, Joe. I think we went a bit out of time, but I really love this conversation. There are so much gold nuggets in here, and we will put this out on LinkedIn. And thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Bob. I really appreciate it.